Good afternoon and welcome to this roundtable discussion. My name is Godela Weiss-Sussex. I'm Professor of German at the ILCS, and I'm really delighted to see you join us for this conversation on Catherine the Great as a celebrity across time. Of course, this event stands in the context of the public fascination with mediated narratives in books, in films, in series of female members of the monarchy. Think of the series The Crown, which probably everyone will have watched at least one or two episodes. Films such as Spencer or Corsage, they are everywhere. So we decided to fashion this event to consider the narratives that are spun about these members of these female members of royalty. So we're asking, how are these narratives spun? By whom are they spun? Who controls them? And we're going to concentrate on, of course, one of the most powerful and also politically and intellectually most commanding royal figures in European history, and that's, of course, Catherine the Great. So my guests at this panel discussion are four speakers with very different areas of expertise, but they all concentrate on this question of representation and narrative. And narrative as constructed by Catherine herself and by others in her own time and now. So I'll briefly introduce the speakers in the order they will speak, and then they will each have time to give a short presentation, no more than 10 minutes, so that we then have time for discussion afterwards. And we're aiming to finish by 5:30, so in an hour and a half. Okay, introductions. Virginia Rounding is a writer and literary critic who specializes in Russia and in women's history. Her biography on Catherine the Great used archive material that hadn't been seen before to foreground perceptions around Catherine as a ruler and a woman. And Virginia also collaborated on the BBC program Empire of the Tsars, Romanov Russia with Lucy Worsley. That was in 2016. Our second speaker today is Kelsey Rubin-Detlev, and she's an assistant professor of Slavic languages and literatures at the University of Southern California. And her research has focused on Catherine's correspondence. She co-translated and co-edited the selected letters of Catherine the Great. That was with Andrew Kahn in 2019. And in the same year, 2019, she also published her award-winning monograph, The Epistolary Art of Catherine the Great. Our third speaker is Ruth Dawson. She's Professor Emerita of Women's Studies at the University of Hawaii, and she's also Honorary Fellow at the ILCS. Her monograph, Catherine the Great and Celebrity Culture in 18th-Century Europe, was published by Bloomsbury last year, so 2022. And in this book, Ruth explores a vast array of media in which the story of Catherine was represented. So she's looking at writers, printmakers, newspaper editors, playwrights, and more. And she's looking at these representations across Europe. So not so much in Russia itself, but how was Catherine represented in other European countries. And our final speaker today is Rhoslyn Beckwith, who has very recently, completed her PhD on 21st century representations of the Austrian Empress Elisabeth, Sisi, and the Prussian Queen Luise. So two 19th century real icons who have been represented in books, in films, etc. So Rhoslyn is ideally placed to comment on Catherine's current representations, and most prominently, she will focus on the mini-series Catherine the Great, which came out in 2019, was scripted by Nigel Williams and starred Helen Mirren. And she'll draw comparisons between that representation and the representation of Sisi and Luise. So that's a broad and very diverse way of approaching the representations of Catherine, and I very much look forward to the conversation that will follow, exploring the continuities and the changes across time of the representations of Catherine. So we'll start with the first presentation, Virginia.
Yeah, we can certainly start off by talking about the initial image because it's on the publicity.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
So the first portrait to look at is the one that you've already seen, I'm glad to say, because it was on the publicity for this event, which is the large state portrait by Vigilius Eriksson, an artist from Copenhagen, who was already in St. Petersburg as the court artist under the Empress Elisabeth. So he was in place at the time of Catherine's coup in 1762 and was immediately commissioned to do some large portraits. This was the second of them. And it was done probably just before her coronation. It appears to be an image of Catherine in a mirror. In fact, when you look at it closely, or even not so closely, you see it is not quite a mirror image after all, because if you look at the Empress's head, you'll see in the mirror, she's looking straight ahead. And you see just her profile, whereas in the image on our side of the mirror, so to speak, she's looking out at us. So that's the most obvious sign that it's in fact two images. Rather than a mirror image. And there's been much discussion as to why this is, but it seems to me what one particularly notices is how the image in the forefront looking at us is very much the attractive young woman, the fashionable woman. Almost the huge hoop skirt is practically the heroine of the picture because it takes up so much of it. Very fashionable with those panniers underneath, and a small head in comparison, very small diadem on top. The regalia of state, of empire, is on the table next to her. The crown designed especially for her coronation, and the orb and scepter. She points towards them in a sort of regal manner, but using a folded fan. So again, you've got a very much a fashionable feminine image here. And she would have had much control over this painting, one of the very first of her state portraits. It was displayed in the Winter Palace for all her courtiers and visitors to see. And so it seems to me that it's very much presenting Catherine as she wished to be shown, both that woman of power and the woman of fashion, the appealing woman as well. So you get the two sides there. It would be a dangerous thing to encounter too much of the woman and forget she's the empress, because you see that very stern profile as well. So I think it's a good way to start really asking ourselves, what precisely is this image and what was its intention to convey? We still can't share the picture with you, but to talk about the next one, I'll show it to myself, and that way at least I'll remember what it is. Is also a Vigilius Eriksson picture, the same painter, the first one that he was commissioned to do for Catherine. And no doubt you've all seen it. It's the famous one of Catherine on her horse Brilliante, the image of her victorious at the head of the Guards regiments as she takes over power from her husband, Peter III. And again, there's some ambiguity in it. the initial image that one picks up is of military might. The sole ruler, there are actually troops one can see behind with their raised rifles, but they're very much in the background. All the people who supported Catherine at the time of her coup are not there. It's Catherine on her own, in control, armed with a sword, and with a picture of the gold cupolas of a monastery complex in the background, suggesting that she's saving Russia, both at the church and its military might and the whole country. And yet there's also still that feminine element here. There's her long flowing unpowdered hair, the one thing, very unusual in a coronation type portrait. Oh, good. She's appeared. So you can actually see her long hair down behind her jacket and her very shapely leg. It really struck me looking at that today, actually. Catherine was very complimentary about her predecessor, the Empress Elisabeth, that those cross-dressing masked balls that Elizabeth used to go in for. And in her memoirs, Catherine has commented that Elizabeth was the only one who looked really good in male dress. And she's clearly here emulating her, showing that she's got just as good a shape as her predecessor. So again, that there is that ambiguity. It's not purely the Empress in a position of power. It's also still that rather appealing, seductive side that she doesn't want her viewers to lose sight of, it seems. I would just like to say that anyone particularly interested in looking more into the state portraits of Catherine, I recommend a PhD thesis by Erin McBurney from Columbia University in 2014, which is obtainable on the web, definitely worth looking at. She goes into a lot of very interesting detail. I'll speed along a bit as we have been a bit held up. This is a third one by the same court artist, Virgilius Ericsson, sometimes called Virgilius and sometimes spelt differently, but it's all him. This is just to show another aspect that Catherine was keen to highlight. Of course, she wasn't Russian, but she wanted to make sure her people thought she was, and that she had the Russian Empire's interests in her heart and soul. And so having herself pictured in Russian costume, this headdress called a kokoshnik, very much a Russian traditional costume, was important to her. Again, you've got the feminine aspect, the rouged cheeks, which apparently Russian women went in for a lot of the time. She's looking, it's not exactly really lifelike somehow, but again, you've got an image of her wanting to put herself across as almost like the mother of the nation, I think, in a way, and certainly a Russian. Now, the next one is a different matter altogether. Here we've got a real likeness, a real portrait of a woman of nearly 58. It's quite a well-known portrait. It's referred to as Catherine in her traveling costume. It's from 1787, when she went with a variety of courtiers and what she referred to as her pocket ministers, various ambassadors who would go back and tell the rest of the world about her exploits, to visit her newly acquired territories in Crimea. And what's particularly interesting about this portrait, it was actually painted by a serf belonging to Grigory Potyomkin. On the beginning of this trip to Crimea, they were all holed up in Kiev for quite a long time because the Dnieper was frozen and they couldn't leave. And they weren't quite sure how long they're going to have to stay there. One of the ways Potyomkin decided to improve the time was, I can't really say to commission Shubanov to do a painting, more likely to tell him to, and to get Catherine's agreement. So and she did agree, and this is probably the only example of a native Russian portrait painter being able to have her actually sit for him. According to an engraver who was given the portrait to engrave later on, the Shubanov was an excellent painter, but also had a tendency to like drink. So they had to force him to stay away from the vodka while he finished the portrait. But maybe he got vodka as payment afterwards. I'd like to hope so. But you can really see it. This is a beautiful portrait. You can look closely. You can really see the sense of the empress as she was, with her powdered hair, but looking naturally greying, with the cares of empire upon her. And there is a sort of a grandmotherly sense to her as well, because she was a very fond grandmother at this point, to particularly Alexander and Constantine. But it's also been pointed out that this could be viewed as a military sort of uniform rather than just a traveling costume. On this particular reproduction, we can just see the top star of St. Andrew, but there were two other orders beneath that as well. So she's not going to let her viewers forget that she's the empress, and she's actually on a voyage looking at her newly acquired territories. And an interesting anecdote from that particular voyage was of one of the people accompanying her, the Comte de Ségur, mistaking something about Catherine. She was a lovely traveling companion, very entertaining. They played various sort of word games and things together, and he thought she'd quite like a risque joke. And he tried it on her, and immediately she went straight back to being the very haughty empress. He was severely put in his place. And so I think that illustrates something that the portrait tells us too. There's both aspects of her there, but you forget she's the empress at your peril. But I think that's a really lovely, really good painting. This one looks similar. It's quite a famous painting by Vladimir Borovikovsky, purports to be Catherine in her gardens at Saskia Selo. But it's another ambiguous painting, because it turns out it's not of Catherine, it's of one of her ladies in waiting. It was commissioned by Alexander Vorontsov, and Catherine probably never saw it. It seems to have been commissioned at a time after who was a senator, he'd been stripped of his responsibilities by Catherine, and his revenge in a way seems to have been to go off and arrange to have this portrait painted for his collection. And so what one does wonder precisely what the motivation is here. Is he trying to portray her as a rather friendly, grandmotherly, non-threatening type in his private collection? Is he trying to make out she was closer to him, a better friend than she was? Whatever it is, there's some kind of power play going on here, and we see something that's actually not really there. Our first reaction looking at it is, oh yes, it's Catherine, one of her greyhounds, as a sort of emblematic giveaway. We know it's Saskia Selo because she has the rostral column commemorating the Battle of Chesley in the background. We know from accounts of people like the Baroness Dimsdale that she did go for early morning walks in her leather shoes and with this sort of coat and white cap on before breakfast. So all the signs are it's Catherine, but actually it isn't. So I think that's quite interesting. And I'll just finish by going back to where we started, because somehow that sense of the mirror that isn't a mirror, it has all those questions of what's the purpose? What are we seeing? What did Catherine want us to see? What did her artist want us to see? Do we see what's there? Did people see what's there? Well, there she is, the great, controversial, ambivalent, endlessly discussable Catherine.
Thank you very much. Okay, well, I think that was already a fascinating start, and it's also nice to start with something as visual as that. So we have been introduced to her. That's lovely. So now Kelsey is going to take over and speak about Catherine as a letter writer.
Yes. Perfect. Do you want to see it as a? I will try clicking slideshow again. Yes. Oh, are you? Oh, you just sort of wave. Okay, perfect. So, okay, when you start the slideshow. Okay.
And
Do you want to start slideshow? Wonderful. Thank you so much, Virginia, for that great introduction. Thank you, Godela, and to everyone who's here. So I'd like to explore a slightly different aspect of Catherine's image making by thinking a bit about Catherine as a writer and networker through the lens of her vast correspondence. So other than her daily in-person performances at court, Catherine's writing was the form of image making that she really controlled most directly and most intimately. And she really wrote quite a lot. She was a self-declared graphomaniac. And so she wrote not just legislation and political theory. So what you see on the screen, she's writing her instruction to the Legislative Commission of 1767, but also drama, satirical journalism, memoirs, fairy tales, history, and several thousand letters. Next slide, please. Should I? Okay, yes, perfect. So now when we think about Catherine as a letter writer and networker, there's actually quite a lot that's rather strikingly modern. Granted, the 18th century manuscript letter feels quite distant from our ephemeral messages on Twitter or WhatsApp. One thinks right away of those sort of rigid etiquette, the weighty material form with wax seals, and in Catherine's case, gold-rimmed paper, or also how long it took messages to arrive, sometimes taking a few weeks to reach their destination. But networking and managed publicity were essential to Catherine's life as they are to ours today. We are very conscious of the gradations between, say, a private email and on the one extreme, and on the other hand, a TikTok video or a public tweet. And it can be very disruptive if certain communications move from one type of publicity to the other. And likewise, each time that Catherine wrote a letter, she very carefully calculated whom she wanted to reach, when, and how. Next slide, please. So we can take as an example Catherine's most famous correspondence, that with Europe's leading writer, the figurehead of the Enlightenment, Voltaire. And here we see him perhaps dictating a letter to Catherine. Their exchange lasted more than 2 decades, from early in Catherine's reign until Voltaire's death in 1778. And for centuries, Russia had been considered an uncivilized barbarian country on the fringes of Asia. And by corresponding with Europe's biggest celebrity writer, Catherine intended to send a clear message that Russia had now become an important member of the European cultural and political space. But how a few manuscript letters could do that is not immediately obvious. But the example of Voltaire shows how letters proved very versatile tools for Catherine to shape her image in the eyes of multiple publics at once. Next slide, please. So when Catherine started exchanging letters with Voltaire, she didn't just put pen to paper and start writing to him. Such a move would be below her dignity as an empress who's supposed to receive a lot of petitions and letters from people of lower rank, but should only condescend to respond to a few. Next slide. Instead, not quite a year after she took the Russian throne from her husband, she wrote a note to one of her secretaries, François-Pierre Pictet, a man from Geneva who had family contacts with Voltaire, whose family had contacts with Voltaire, and she asked him to inform the writer that the culture of letters is going to appear completely among princesses and their countries. So she wanted Voltaire to know and to make public that she planned to combine immense political power with an Enlightenment belief in the power of culture and the life of the mind. Pictet understood her intention and forwarded the note to Voltaire. And after an appreciative response from Voltaire and a letter received by Pictet, Catherine wrote again through the same secretary, attempting to set the terms for a correspondence. Next slide, please. In that letter, in quite characteristic fashion, she enunciated a crucial principle through a show of modesty and irony. Since Voltaire would, of course, not admire her letters, she claimed, he would most certainly not publish them. Now, it's important to understand what Catherine meant when she said that she didn't want the letters to be published. This certainly did not mean that the letters were supposed to be completely or permanently private. That would, of course, defeat the point. But the full text of the letter should not yet be put in print. Rather, rigorously regulated and measured publicity would ensure the maximal effect. But despite this blatant invitation to become an imperial correspondent, Voltaire at first refused to write back directly. He didn't want to get too closely associated with an empress whom everyone expected to be overthrown quickly. And I think that this initial refusal is a helpful reminder of the uphill battle that Catherine had to fight in her image making. Next slide, please. It took another 2 years before real correspondence got started. Voltaire publicly signaled his interest by dedicating his Philosophie de l'Histoire to Catherine in 1765, which allowed her to respond to thank him without any injury to her dignity, and the exchange took off from there. Next slide again. Catherine obviously wanted the correspondence to be reflected indirectly in Voltaire's published writings. Being mentioned in the works of Voltaire was a guaranteed way to win the attention of a pan-European audience. And Voltaire did, as was expected. He alluded to and quoted selectively from Catherine's letters in several published works in the later 1760s and early 1770s, portraying Russia as a tolerant society under an enlightened empress. But for this to work as a publicity strategy, the vast majority of the letters had to stay out of print. His selective quoting and allusions created a sense of it for readers of getting an exclusive glimpse into the mind and activities of a distant empress. And this impression of an exclusive scoop was a key mechanism that helped to create Catherine as a celebrity, which is Ruth's domain. Next slide, please. It was also not really an illusion. Far more of Catherine's correspondence was meant to circulate amongst a restricted circle of privileged elites on whom she relied as opinion makers and official decision makers. Catherine was perfectly well aware that Voltaire would discuss her correspondence and share some copies of letters with influential people. These included the high-ranking statesmen like the Duc de Richelieu, or friends like Madame du Deffand, a prominent salon hostess. Not just salon hostesses, but also those who attended salon, like Voltaire's friend and fellow imperial correspondent, Jean-Laurent d'Alembert, would be able to share information about Catherine with others who frequented those spaces of sociability. These were not just, again, men and women of letters, but also, and especially government ministers, French government ministers, for example, and diplomats. To write to Voltaire was for Catherine a means of being plugged into an extensive network of thinkers, writers, socialites, and politicians who could spread the word about a newly modernized, Europeanized Russia and its empress. Next slide again, please. The range of modes of epistolary publicity, though, doesn't even stop there. Catherine counted on the existence and practice of espionage to spread her own image. When sending letters, she always had the option of sending a special courier who could maintain the secrecy of the text, ensure that the message got there quickly, bring lavish gifts, and make a very grand impression on the recipient. So on the screen, you see that the recipient of this letter, the German doctor Johann Georg von Zimmermann, has noted down the name of the courier who brought the letter, a certain Malinowski. But Catherine often chose intentionally to send her letters by post. They were delivered far more slowly, but not just because of bad roads. Rather, postal officials in France and in all the countries through which her letter passed on the way were likely to recognize the imperial handwriting and open the letter to spy on its contents. Catherine was a savvy user of these so-called cabinets noirs, or black chambers, which allowed her to use her letters to Voltaire, for example, to exhibit Russian military and financial might before the French government, which at that time had a quite strong anti-Russian policy. Next slide. As was inevitable, this correspondence quickly found a much broader readership shortly after Voltaire's death, when it was published in the highly prestigious Kehl edition of Voltaire's complete works. In the short term, this was a failure of Catherine's publicity management. The publication occurred without her direct permission, and she demanded immediate censorship of the volume's contents. There were potentially serious political consequences for this too early revelation of the letters, and then as now one usually would publish a collection of letters after both correspondents were dead. By the mid-1780s, France was not so much Russia's enemy, and there was even the possibility of an alliance. And so the Russian Empress's biting sarcasm about France and its government in the letters to Voltaire, dating from over a decade before, could only be an embarrassment. Yet in the longer term, the letter's publication realized Catherine's ultimate vision. Whenever she wrote a letter, Catherine was thinking not only of the addressee and the immediate small circle of people who would soon be reading it. She always had an additional addressee in mind, us. Catherine wanted to go down in history alongside the great classical models, Augustus, Alexander the Great. So she wrote with the lucid awareness and intent that many of her letters would one day be published and read by historians and educated people. And so her letters publication in the Kale edition marked her apotheosis as an Enlightenment writer. She's a worthy correspondent of Voltaire, enshrined for posterity, given her own volume in this edition. Next slide again. And from there, one of her letters to Voltaire even entered an epistolary manual used in French schools well into the second half of the 19th century. So she becomes an enduring literary model in that sense. Next slide again. And today the letters are continuing to reach new audiences and provoke new conversations in ways that Catherine very certainly could not have imagined. But the new approaches of a digital age do continue to build the historical understanding of her life that she'd always expected her letters would provide. And finally, last slide. So just to sort of sum up, I think looking at Catherine's correspondence really gives us a key element in the strategies used to construct and to control her image, managing the modes and degrees of publicity given to her imperial words, so choosing whom to speak to, how, and when. These were arts that Catherine practiced throughout her 34-year reign in pursuit of reputation, celebrity, and power in her own time, and working towards an indisputably important historical legacy in ours. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Let's see, we have the second layer now. Yeah? we have the images, we have the letter writing, and we are now moving on to Ruth and to hear about representations of Catherine outside of Russia.
So, Jane, how much control do I have? None. Okay. Okay. That's a bit confusing, but well, I'll do what I can. So we have established a number of things already. That Catherine was a rich and suddenly powerful woman in the 18th century, and one who cared very much about the representation of herself that she sent out into the world. What I want to make explicit that we've kind of assumed but haven't really said, is that she came to power by overthrowing the legitimate Tsar, the grandson of Peter the Great. She overthrew this man when he was 6 months into his reign, and she seized power. I'm going to talk about representations of Catherine that were made for popular audiences outside Russia, representations that turned Catherine into an international celebrity during her lifetime. This has to do with our title here, a celebrity across time. My definition of celebrity, by the way, is that it is a discourse that arises when a broad audience establishes an intense personal feeling relationship to a famous contemporary based on abundant representations in words and images of that person that are widely commodified. So it has celebrity, as we know, thinking about it today, has a lot to do with money. A crucial prerequisite for the existence of large-scale celebrity is large-scale media, usually non-government media. And that means the media, large-scale media, will have access to a large population. Well, that kind of media existed in the 18th century. Next slide. The most important media representing Catherine to the general public was newspapers initially, and then magazines. She could influence them, but not control them. As it turns out, she couldn't quite control Voltaire either, or what happened to her letters after he died. But newspapers, in any case, were very abundant in the 18th century. They were ready to disseminate official and unofficial, unauthorized representations of the new empress, so they became extremely important. Here's one example, just a quick look at how newspapers reported the coup. That's the front page of the London Evening Post, and click once. Jane, I think you'll, okay, that's what I wanted to show. you can see that there's the top corner of the picture of the front page is actually a report from the London Gazette, which was the government newspaper reporting government official messages. And it announces yesterday, Her Imperial Majesty, the Empress of Russia, was proclaimed sole and reigning empress and sovereign of this empire by the name of Catherine II. And immediately thereupon, the several orders, ecclesiastical, civil, and military, took the oaths of fidelity to Her Imperial Majesty and to her son, the great Duke Paul, as her lawful heir. This was the announcement of the coup. But then, click again, Jane, let's see. Oh, okay, it's not working. Oh, you're not getting slideshow view. I think that's the problem. Can you do it in slideshow? Because, okay, try again. A few more clicks here. Okay, and if you click that one again, okay, now this column here then goes into something that it calls private letters from Petersburg, say, and then we start to get the story about Catherine dressing in men's clothing, leading the coup, as we saw in the painting that, that Virginia elucidated to us. So the newspapers contain literally layers of reporting, authorized and unauthorized. But newspaper, they elicited a lot of attention, but they had no pictures, except for mastheads and decorated letters like the Y that I showed you before. And the newspaper audiences, the non-elite general public, quickly wanted to see what this upstart woman looked like. They wanted printed images of her, but there was a problem. How did printmakers make an image of a distant woman whom they had never seen? I'm going to sketch the key strategies to you that they have used. So this is going to be interesting to see how this works. Next one, Jane, if you can. Okay, and again. One more. Okay, so here's a painting of Catherine as Grand Duchess. So this is before she had conducted the coup. Copies of this painting had been sent to various places, many different courts in Europe, and there had also been an engraving made of it. So that was, of course, what engravers wanted to find, was pictures like this of her, and then they could copy them in different formats, different sizes, and so on, and sell them. And we'll see how that works. Click. I think some will show up. So these are different variations of that painting that were made. You can see they're similar, but they are very different in their skill level and in the impression that you get of the Empress, all based, however, on that original pre-imperial painting. And one more click. The cheapest, easiest way to make a painting, a painting is to just copy it directly. But if you do that, you end up with a mirror image. And of course, that is generally an indication of a less skilled engraver. Engravers in general had learned how to do things in reverse, but a less skilled one might not be able to do it. So what we're seeing here is this range of representations made based on paintings with a range of skill levels too. Now, the next strategy that was used was a very smart one. Just take a painting or an engraving that already exists and change the label on it. I really like this one. This is Josepha over here, and over here you can see the same painting, and now it's relabeled Katerina Alexievna Rusorum Imperatrix. The crown has been jazzed up a little bit and enlarged, but otherwise it's exactly the same meanwhile dead woman. So that would be another strategy. There are a number of instances of this, and I like the fact that this one is from the Royal Collection here in Britain. And then another strategy, the one that after copying paintings was used most often, was to invent a picture, to just plain think, well, okay, I'm supposed to produce a picture of Catherine the Great. I have no idea what she looks like, but neither does anybody I'm going to send this picture to or sell it to have any idea. So I'll just make a very grand princess. And that's what many printmakers did. They were meeting a demand to see what she looked like, and they were making money from it. And they produced very often pictures like of this kind that were full length, in essence, fashion prints. And you can see she's not wearing the fashions that we saw in the paintings. So these are fashions that the printmaker thinks people wanted to see her in. These images generally have an informative caption. So if you're sharing your print with a neighbor, you can talk with them about who her parents were and the dates and so on. There's a kind of a background going on here of a battle, which is intriguingly transgressive. And the whole thing suggests a story, who this woman is and what her setting is and so on. And story is absolutely critical to the development and continuation of celebrity. Now, this picture here that I'm showing you is rather large, somewhat like A4 size. And that means it was relatively expensive because paper was expensive. So there were some other strategies for making cheaper prints. One of them would be to use a wood block. You can make many more copies from a wood block than you can from a copper engraving. Copper is relatively soft, and after a certain point, the engravings aren't any good anymore. So this one on the left is copper. This one on the right is still an engraving. It's rather clumsy, wouldn't you say? Rather a small head and arms, rather long and a bit peculiarly located and so on. But it's rather small, about the size of a postcard. And so this is the kind of images that were invented. They were captioned in various languages, often had but not always had explanatory captions. They responded to different tastes, and they were in a range of prices, that's for sure. And now comes my favorite of the woodblock prints. With another click, I think, there. Now that one, I think, would probably have disappointed Catherine quite a bit. And I also think it could quite well have been used for many different, rulers. But you can see across the top here, it says, representation of the Russian Empress Katerina II. So there she is, unmistakably and ready to be reproduced many times. So those were the main strategies, especially at the beginning. But later in her reign, another strategy evolved for representations of Catherine, and that is in satires. This was a completely different kind of approach to showing her. This particular one was probably made in Germany. It has a text in French. It is satirizing her involvement in the partition of Poland, and the title is "The Circumcision of Stanislaus, the King of Poland." But you actually pretty much had to be literate in order to quite get the joke. Even though you can see this woman taking clothes off the man and kind of pointing at his genitals, you still needed a little sense, some notion about this whole circumcision idea. Other satires were not nearly so restrained. I'm not really going to linger over them. We can talk about them later if we want to, but they tended to, they were often obscene. They used obscenity and scatology to grab attention and to criticize. These two are English and Dutch. And I'm going to conclude with one that was made in France. The next slide. So this is a very large, well-designed, nicely painted, expensive satirical image, making fun of the members of the French court who had fled Versailles and were hoping for help from Catherine. They were parked in various places in Germany. And we can see here a great preening Catherine. In fact, I liked her a lot. And so if you click one more time, you can see I used her on the cover of my book. So let me just recap here. Celebrity, as I said before, is a discourse that arises when a broad audience establishes an intense relation to a famous contemporary based on representations in words and images of that person that are widely commodified. So could and did celebrity exist in the 18th century? Well, obviously, I think so. Was there an audience for it? And was Catherine such a one? I think that the quantity and quality of texts and images strongly indicate that that was the case. Thank you.
Many, many thanks, Ruth. And
So
we're now starting to sort of see themes emerging, aren't we? There are going to be, themes in the discussion that will reoccur. And I see that Rhoslyn is nodding, so there's probably some more content that links in. Rhoslyn, over to you.
Yeah, so I'd just like to say thank you to all of you for giving such fascinating presentations, and particularly to Ruth. I didn't realise that image of the bottom was coming, but I feel I should warn you, everybody, there will be another bottom. So I'm sorry in advance. And there's also a little bit of swearing and a teeny tiny bits of references to sexual acts. But all I'm going to say is this is not my choice. It's actually from Catherine the Great. So today I'm going to be discussing one of the more recent adaptations of Catherine's life, the 2019 HBO and Sky Atlantic miniseries entitled Catherine the Great, starring Dame Helen Mirren. So I hope to briefly show how present-day postmodernist approaches to the past are increasingly turning the spotlight on that which is overlooked by the historical record. Nevertheless, even in this supposedly more enlightened era, misogyny, particularly with regard to the portrayal of a powerful and sexual woman, continues to play a role. Perhaps we have not made as much progress as we may like to think. Next slide, please. So just as a quick summary for those who haven't seen the series, we initially meet Catherine in 1772 when she is 43. She has been in power for 10 years after her husband's convenient death. They don't talk about who explicitly, but she is struggling to retain control of her throne amidst plots from her son, her ministers, including her ex-lover, Grigory Orlov, as well as rival claims to the throne. Next slide, please. So the series then moves through the next 2 decades of her life, concentrating primarily on Catherine's on-off relationship with Grigory Potemkin. That's how they pronounce it in the show. Going for that. Described as the only man she ever loved. So Catherine's fraught feelings for her weak son, Paul, are also mentioned, as well as her battles with her ministers over the extent of her control. While the romance plot dominates, the series also shines a spotlight on the Russo-Turkish War, in which Potemkin distinguishes himself, and Russia's invasion of the Crimea. A task seemingly single-handedly accomplished by Potemkin for the love of Catherine. The series concludes in 1796 with Catherine's death from a stroke at the age of 67. Next slide, please. So from the outset, this series differs in its approach from the traditional tendencies of Catherine the Great's filmic and televisual adaptations. While the majority of these have focused on the Empress at the start of her marriage, as can be seen from these 4 images, Helen Mirren was in her early 70s at the time of filming, playing the role of a 43-year-old woman. So this change of focus is only one example of the way in which this series introduces the tendencies of postmodernism into Catherine the Great's corpus. Engaging with Linda Hutchins' theories of postmodernism, this production turns its back on the grand narratives of the past, asking its audience to question the way in which history has been represented, playfully engaging with and subverting the canon. So the series is therefore filled with examples of postmodern denaturalizing, a term coined by Hutchins to describe the simultaneous inscribing and subverting of the conventions of narrative. Highly explicit language is used throughout, challenging the audience's expectations of such a series. At one point, for instance, Catherine, Helen Mirren, by the way, declares, "There are those who are sure that I am a fucking witch. Well, I read Latin, I like to screw young men, which, clearly," as well as claiming that Frederick the Great refers to her in private as a cunt. Sorry, don't want to say that word. There were also frequent overtly sexual scenes throughout. In the picture on the left, we see the Empress reassuring a young lover who has been unable to perform in the bedroom. And on the right, she is dismissing a different young lover post-coitus so that she can return to work. I have spared today's audience anything more explicit than this. But the series does include one scene in which Countess Bruce, Catherine the Great's dearest friend in this series, manually stimulates Potemkin to orgasm during an operatic performance in full view of the Empress to incite her jealousy. You didn't need to see that face. So this subversive approach contrasts sharply with the traditions of the royal biographical genre, which is more commonly associated with overt nostalgia, idealizing the past as a time of high morals, romantic love, and standards of etiquette. Instead, this series turns towards what Marie-Louise Kolker terms perverse nostalgia, a postmodern variant of nostalgia which focuses deliberately, often sensationally, on the unsavory aspects of history, creating a sinister wonderland populated by lurking monsters and hapless victims. While there may not be literal monsters here, this series turns the spotlight on the sweat, the blood, and the scandal beneath the corsets and the finery. This subversive focus reflects a trend which is proving increasingly prominent within representations of historical narratives transnationally, from Jonathan Rhys-Meyers' rather sexed up Henry VIII and the Tudors to the recent prize-winning film Corsage, which reframes Empress Elisabeth as a cigarette-smoking, tattooed and psychologically tortured eccentric. To a certain extent then, a series like Catherine the Great demonstrates how contemporary values and sentiments can be placed upon the past, updating our views of history, and in this instance, allowing the Empress to be reframed as almost a proto-feminist. Next slide, please. Helen Mirren herself has remarked in interviews on the change in approach heralded by this series, declaring that the rumours about Catherine's voracious sexual appetite were used to discredit her, and that the story of her death being caused by intercourse with a horse represented a classic way of belittling her. It seems, therefore, even more surprising that in spite of these noted attempts to modernise Catherine's story and to seemingly celebrate the Empress's ability to function as both a sensual woman and a capable, powerful ruler, misogynistic elements continue to abound. Next slide, please. So, while superficially the series portrays Catherine as the one woman controlling all of Russia, she is also shown to be a woman alone, guided and at times ordered by a sea of men, as seen here, who surround and plot against her. These ministers repeatedly reinforce the idea that it is only their masculine action which has placed her in her position. Count Orloff, for instance, declares, "We put you on the throne," the unspoken threat being that they can also have her removed. These ministers, along with her son Paul, also employ anti-feminist rhetoric to manipulate her, while the series itself seems to want to challenge historic attitudes towards Catherine's love life. These ministers again and again use her sexual appetites to denigrate her reputation. For instance, one of her opponents does actually mention that horse rumour, despite Mirren's claim, saying, "She wants to fuck everything she sees, including my horses." In a highly sexist manner, they also use her sexual impulses to control her behaviour. Her ministers intentionally place young, attractive men in her path on multiple occasions to distract her from their own plots and intrigues. Even Catherine's own lover, Potemkin, organises a replacement paramour to occupy the Empress in his absence, which does sit rather uncomfortably within a supposedly feminist retelling of this history. In many ways, then, this series once again robs the Russian Empress of her agency, making her the puppet of these men. The narrative of a sexual woman remains problematic, engaging with the Madonna versus whore dichotomy, a conceit which continues to be present within so many narratives of prominent women to this day. One only has to look at the media's coverage of Meghan, Duchess of Sussex, and Catherine, Princess of Wales, to see how prevalent this remains. Catherine's own moral trajectory throughout the series also seems to support the argument that women in power are troubling. The plot of the series demonstrates how power has corrupted her, seemingly endorsing her son's opinion that a woman ought never again to rule Russia. While in the first episode, Catherine makes a speech championing liberal values and claiming that she will abolish serfdom and slavery during her reign. Next slide, please. By the final episode, Catherine is burning Rousseau's books. The expression on her face here just demonstrates how even she is aware of how far she has fallen from her initial ideals. Next slide, please. Perhaps, though, the most overt example of this taming of the shrew narrative takes place during the final minutes of the series. After Catherine's funeral, the episode flashes back 10 years to the secret marriage between Catherine and Potemkin. Historical rumours do exist that this might have happened, but it remains a rumour. Nevertheless, its presence here demonstrates the way in which this series once again domesticates and reduces the problematic woman. Catherine may be the Empress of Russia. However, the very fact that she has consented to marry demonstrates her willingness to allow herself to be ruled by a man. A sharp contrast from the way in which we have witnessed her fighting for dominance throughout. Her love affair with Potemkin has up until this point appeared as a never-ending battle for control, with Catherine declaring, "I own you, don't forget that," to Potemkin, curiously telling him that she will not be dictated to. This marriage plot, therefore, feels uncomfortably neat and traditionally patriarchal, subjugating Catherine into a traditional gender role and placing her under the control of her husband. Even the way in which her successes are summarized by Countess Bruce. "You showed the world what women can achieve, and you loved the greatest man of the age," seems once again to reduce this extraordinary woman into a subordinate character within her own narrative. One reviewer, Daniel Feinberg, rather appositely suggested that not only might the series be more appropriately titled Catherine and Gregory, by its closing installments, it's probably closer to Gregory and Catherine. So to end this brief analysis, I would like to look at this screenshot of the last words to fill the screen before the credits roll. After her death, Paul undid his mother's achievements and muddied her reputation with rumour and innuendo. This series, though, appears to demonstrate the extent to which we are still complicit in such practices. Even into the 21st century, the narrative of a powerful woman remains highly problematic. Within postmodern works, there is a desire to sanitize, to tame, and to defang women who threaten the patriarchy. A stark contrast from the alleged goals of celebrating a woman's agency and sexuality. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to you. Well, that was fantastic, and we have lots of strands to pick up. I think I'll start with something that is so obvious and so in the room that we just have to start with it, and that's to quote from Ruth's book, "The story is everything." It's all about, or story is critical, I think you say. And it is, isn't it? It's about the, who tells the story, who constructs the narrative, for whom, who has the control, to what extent does Catherine control, to what extent is she being controlled? So that seems to be absolutely critical here. And my question to you all is, to what extent is what we've heard about Catherine and what you know about Catherine, to what extent is that special, different to what we know about other celebrities, other female celebrities?
Well, I can try to do something with that.
Right.
Well, first of all, I believe that she was as I think I quickly said here, I believe she was the first international female celebrity. So she was marking the standards that would, I think, be used after her. And to some extent, perhaps simultaneously with her. I think I haven't tried to compare her with, let's say, Marie Antoinette, but I think there would be possibilities there. Marie Antoinette, of course, came to public attention much later than Catherine did. So Catherine had already set some patterns there. But I think that the degree to which she became known in countries across Europe was really impressive. And a lot of it had to do with newspapers, which at the time were coming out. It varied from once a week to 5 times a week, and they needed to fill their pages just as now. So there are many ways actually in which it's astonishing how many similarities there are. So they needed to fill their pages, and they had begun to elicit this kind of personal intense relationship, and therefore people were interested in reading about dinner parties that Catherine had, about when she went off to different palaces, trivial stuff like that. They were interested in the trivial, and that was nurtured by newspapers, and then was picked up to some extent with the prints. But I guess I'm really struck by how much exactly that continues now. People want to see pictures of Kate in her, in her backyard. They want to catch those supposedly unguarded moments, as though there aren't any. And they want that to be accurate, but they're willing for it to be rather full of fantasy too. They're not really scrupulous. So that's where I would go.
I think within Catherine's own time, I think she's a bit different from other women in this because of her position. I think, for one thing, if you think within Russia, she's actually the 4th sovereign empress. Mind she's the last, but she was the 4th. So the fact of her being female was not particularly surprising to anybody within Russia, although very surprising to people outside Russia still, because Catherine has a higher profile, publicly in Europe than any of her predecessors. And I think in terms of the gender flexibility that Virginia was so nicely talking about, that is opened up to her by being a sovereign. Right, the sovereign by definition, you can see this with Maria Theresa in a similar period, has to fulfill multiple roles, multiple gender roles, military, the mother of the nation. And so she has flexibility that other women don't have, but also as an elite woman, she's not the only female royal of her time who is writing, who is, putting herself out there, that in print, for example, or maybe less in print, but also just known as an intellectual, right? The sort of path of being an intellectual is open to elite women in a way that it's not to ordinary women. They can be a sort of leisured, person who's pursuing the life of the mind, as long as it's not a professional activity, right? So I think thinking about her within her own time, there's this sort of interesting intersection between gender and sort of class or social role that is I always find fascinating as well.
Because you could have just as well have gone for the more masculine, in order to sort of, support her power. But she has, as you were also saying, she's always portrayed, and always clearly herself also been wanting to be portrayed as feminine.
I think there's that sense of surprise around the world about Catherine. The way that, for instance, early on, one of the British ambassadors said, "Oh, she's trying to get a navy together, but they'll never be as good as ours." And then she does Russia attains great power under her. And of course, she does all that collecting, including various collections like Walpole's, and getting it knocked down price. And so this sort of voraciousness, it's almost as though people weren't expecting it really on the global scene. She was just another Russian empress, and she'd sort of probably be assassinated before long. And she's not. And she has this massive success in terms of physical possessions and of course possessions of land. And so I think there's that kind of amazement, partly why you get all these caricatures, sort of resentment, and how could this be?
Mhm.
And I think that's what makes her so ripe for reinterpretation now. I mean, it's the sort of subversive woman upon the throne that we're really interested in. I mean, we were talking, so we've got Marie Antoinette. Really interestingly, I don't know if anyone's seen The Great. I think somebody may have got a bit confused in their research because they claim that she was from Vienna rather than from Prussia, Catherine. So I do wonder if they got a bit confused with Marie Antoinette like when they were doing their research. So that I thought that was quite an interesting interlink thing there. But I mean, in this series, she is German. She talks about her German mother, who she hated. But actually, it is these women who haven't quite fitted the mold society expected them to fill that we're really interested in. So, I mean, I specialize in Sisi, who is fascinating, so Empress Elisabeth of Austria. And I think one of the reasons that she's become so interesting in recent years, and particularly with films like Corsage and the Netflix series The Empress, is because she didn't do what was expected of her. And in the same way, Catherine, in many ways, I do agree that some of the series that particularly Catherine the Great, I mean, it's interesting, but it could be a completely fictional, it could be about somebody else, and you could replace, in the same way that you're talking about having replaced the statue, at times it feels like the things that are important are, she had a lot of sex, there's a rumor about a horse, and it's sort of shoehorned in there, just in case anyone's not sure that we're really talking about Catherine, but it's for an audience who is maybe not so aware of the Russian history. Yeah. And actually a lot of the criticism has been, if you'd read the Russian history, you'd understand what was going on when you kind of read the kind of criticism of the series. But actually, I think her difference from others is what has kept her ripe and available to be refreshed and readapted throughout the centuries, really.
I think I'm going to have to come clean at this point and admit that I was the historical advisor for Catherine the Great. Sorry.
Well, you got it right.
Oh, no, there's no need to apologise. No. I mean, and yeah, I mean, I must say the bit about Vienna must have escaped me.
But no, that was The Great, as in not this series.
Oh, not this. Oh, that's a relief.
This was the one.
Thank you.
No,
right.
No, you're
Helen Mirren one.
The Helen Mirren one was much better.
No, there's no need to say that. And my job primarily was to find images. They wanted to know what things looked like. So I did a lot of art historical stuff. And it was things like, what did her signature look like? And how would she have put a seal on an envelope? And who would be standing at the door when somebody arrived? And it was all that stuff. I did really try to stop them having the book burning sequence. I kept saying, she couldn't have burnt books. Oh, no, got to have that bit in. And various other things. And they did want to very much make it about her and Potemkin as a great love thing. And that was sort of it. And there's a bit that when I saw it in the end, I was so embarrassed I hadn't picked them up on, when they say about, here's the German ambassador. Couldn't they at least have said Prussian? But that's how it was. And it does, I have to admit, it does look quite nice. But my overall feeling about the whole series when I'd seen it was actually, it wasn't really about anything. Nothing really happened, did it?
I kind of thought it was sort of Game of Thrones, but not Game of Thrones.
But
like
no kind of plot. So if you weren't interested in Imperial Russia and Catherine and her lovers and the fact that she lived for a long time and died and got a lot of land, it was sort of, well, so what really? And so really, I think it's largely a vehicle for Helen Mirren.
I mean,
in fancy dress.
Yeah, and to say,
she looked amazing in the male costumes too. Can I just point out her legs as well?
You're quite right. The only bit I think with her, with her hands give her age away, which her hands to all of us. So, but anyway,
but that is the problem, isn't it? With the sort of popular. With a popular form, I mean, you wouldn't know that she was conversing with, with Voltaire from that series. You wouldn't know. You didn't hear anything about her philosophical idea. You hardly heard anything about her political ideas. So there's a whole different person there, isn't there? And I think it's that. But that's the problem of the media, isn't it? And looking at the cross-section of the different media that you have presented here. I was wondering, also looking at the caricatures and so on. So there is no way of containing her, is there? Of containing her into one way of representation, because she has the political power, because she has the philosophical mind, and she has the femininity. So how do the different media put different layers onto what we see? That's, is there a way of disentangling that, do you think?
No, I think there is.
No, okay.
I just think it's fascinating to go from something like Virginia's biography of Catherine, which tells a coherent story of her life, and I think treats all of these issues very judiciously, but nonetheless can't capture the richness of the correspondence that Kelsey and her co-editor have put together. The richness of that correspondence is just overwhelming. And at the same time, I think it's very interesting because to some extent, Catherine is known as an enlightened ruler. That is part of her image, to the extent that people today have an image of her. She is the only woman who's called the Great. But that intellectual element, which is at least in hints, maybe that's the part that really does distinguish her from other celebrities. Because I think that certainly makes her different from her contemporaries, makes her radically different from Maria Theresa, from Marie Antoinette, as the two possible comparisons among women, but puts her closer, much closer to another celebrity of her time, which would be Frederick II. So, but it is really interesting, this oscillation between the feminine and the masculine in her. And I really like the way that Virginia has pointed out that these images, which seem to show reflections, are actually completely are separate sides of one person, which we always have to keep in mind with her, I think.
I think that's really interesting with a woman as well, because I don't think that's something that you see in a lot of even sort of contemporary accounts of women having these two natures. It's sort of a man can have the public and the private self, whereas the woman has only got, she's forced to stay within the private sphere.
Yeah.
So it's almost quite shocking in a way that she can be both.
Yeah.
That's quite remarkable.
Yes, that's right. And I think maybe some of that does seep through and does help to make her be somehow meaningful even now.
Let me just ask one more question before we open out to the audience. We can't not talk about the fact that she was an imperialist. She was intent on annexing New Russia and the Crimea. How do we look at that today?
My theories, it's all out of love. Basically, Potemkin is a knight errant, and poor Catherine, she's just sat there, has nothing to do with it really. She's just sat there in Russia waiting. And Potemkin, he's so fraught, he can't sit still basically. He does seem like he's got ants in his pants most of the series, and he has to get out there. He has to prove his love. And the only way he can do that is to conquer the Crimea and to bring it back for Catherine and to also find Sebastopol. So basically, there's no, Catherine did nothing apart from just be wonderful, and she was loved. I just feel like this needs to be pointed out. She was loved by the best man.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm sure that is
I mean, that's my contribution. Sorry. I know it's rather a straightforward answer, but I've learned a lot from the series.
we did learn from the series, clearly. So maybe we can put some sort of counter interpretations out there as well to challenge the series.
Yes. Well, yeah, there's no denying she was a colonialist, as you say. It was part of her modus operandi. It was what she thought she was there for, to increase the glory of the Russian Empire, make it bigger and huge on the world stage. I mean, if there's any, I wouldn't say justification, but any rationale for it. She's so against the idea of Russia being backward, not having power, being subordinate to particularly these snooty English, who would talk down to her. She was going to prove that she was their equal, and the way to do it was to seize a lot of territory from the Turks. So, and to have this idea that unfortunately some of her successors continue to parrot, that Russia is the new Byzantium and should be taking over the whole of the Orthodox world and so on and so forth. It really doesn't work now. But she thought she was doing it for the best, for the glory of her country and for the subjects who she took under her control. I think one can't and one shouldn't put images, thoughts into people's minds who are long dead, but I can't help on a sort of personal level feeling she'd be utterly horrified at what's going on now. The idea of bombs being dropped on civilian houses and so forth. She wouldn't have done that.
Yeah, I mean, I think Catherine does need to be part of the conversation about the history of Russian imperialism, and I think that I mean, what immediately comes to mind, of course, is how raw this history is still in the minds of people in Ukraine and Russia today. But also, I think, from an academic perspective, what immediately comes to mind is the way the discourses surrounding imperialism, the ideas that are driving it, change over time to the point that they almost look diametrically opposed, right? If you're looking in the 18th century, it's discourses about Russia spreading European civilization, understood as universal civilization, bringing standardized rule of law to these territories. And then, in the 19th century, you get discourses of nationalism that were not around in the 18th century, and then the Soviet heritage. And then by the time you get to today's world, all of these discourses are layered on top of one another and combining in sometimes stunning ways. And so I think that history needs to be kept in mind.
And the only thing I would add is that when she seized these additional territories, it was perfectly clear to her that they were not traditionally Russian. She would never made the claim that Crimea had originally been Russian and somebody else had taken it away. As far as I know, she never said anything of that sort. She realized that it had had its own government, but it had been under the influence of the Turks, and she was fighting all kinds of wars with the Turks. So it seemed like fair game, I think, more or less. But it wasn't an argument that this was inherently Russian.
Okay, thank you. Questions from the audience? If you want to ask a question from elsewhere on Zoom, please just put your hand up, as it were, your virtual hand, or write in the chat. Can we access the chat? Yes, or write in the chat. But yes. Floor open. Yes.
Do you have anything about what the Prussian press said about Catholic? You have shown us on the Western press, or rival press, or from rival countries. But what did the Russians say about her? Is there any?
There was not a Russian press. So there was a newspaper in St. Petersburg. I think it was the only newspaper in St. Petersburg. It was German. So it was published in German by Germans. There was a large German population of merchants and servants and doctors and all kinds of people there, and they had a newspaper. But there was not even a court gazette, at least at the time of the coup. I don't know if one was when they started having such a paper. If they did.
I mean, under Catherine, the press does grow.
It grows.
Significantly.
That's true.
And I think, but obviously what is put out in the press within Russia is fairly closely controlled. You do get various, local reports when, Catherine passed through this local area, you get, official accounts of what's happening. But the sort of salacious details that you get obviously in the West are not being printed in Russia, although it's also important to remember that the small group of people who were readers in Russia are elites who oftentimes can read in foreign languages. So people in Russia, the elites in Russia are also very well aware of all of these representations in the West, whether they're traveling or simply receiving copies of things there. So there are multi-layered perceptions.
Yeah, newspapers got mailed all over the place. Catherine herself frequently mentions in her letters, mentions reading the newspapers and what is being said there about her. But yeah, it wasn't the same range of unofficial, unauthorized representations. But I have to say, in France, for example, there was only one official newspaper. There were various local versions of it, but only one official newspaper. So the French, who wanted to really know what was going on in the world, bought French language newspapers that were printed in Holland or in Germany. The Gazette de Cologne, which she mentions reading, was printed in Cologne. So you couldn't, the rule of thumb for the 18th century was, aside from Britain, you couldn't criticize your own ruler, but you could read a newspaper from next door and they could criticize him.
Did Catherine speak only French, or did she speak Russian too?
She spoke Russian, French, and German.
She didn't speak Russian.
No,
Russian,
yes.
French, and German. Yes, she spoke all three.
No Russian. She didn't.
Oh, yes.
She did speak Russian. She prided herself on her ability. Obviously,
Could she write in Russian as well?
she does. She writes extensively in Russian. Obviously, government business is done in Russian. Her love letters are primarily in Russian because all but one.
A lot of her plays are in Russian.
Are in Russian, exactly.
She wrote plays, which are very, very interesting. And they were published in Russian, I think in some cases in French and in German. She had them translated. She had her secretaries translate them into German.
Yeah, thank you. It's interesting we're a female-dominated room. I'm not convinced by your account of the Helen Mirren film. I mean, it seems to me, I'm not quite sure what's postmodern about it. From your description of the film, it seems like a very trashy Hollywood version which takes a liberal interpretation of history. What's new? I mean, the Marlene Dietrich version was similar. I just think that basically the comparison with Meghan is not very valid either. Meghan is a complete non-entity. She's trying to carve out a role which is unsuited to her. Yeah. Whereas Catherine was suited to the role she adopted, and I just don't see the comparison there. The idea that it's postmodern seems to me a very strange interpretation of the word postmodern, because when we're talking about the grand narrative, which grand narrative is being challenged here? It's just a. I mean, let me give you an example. Take the recent series of War and Peace, which was made for an American audience, and it portrayed Pierre as a wimp. This was supposed to be a postmodern view of Pierre, whereas the original story, Pierre is not a wimp. I mean, he's clumsy in many ways, socially and so on, but he's not a wimp. And the television series portrayed him as a wimp who had real difficulty with women. Well, that's not actually the original story. And another issue which you mentioned in the film is that you say that the politics told her, we put you on the throne.
Ministers, yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is a trope throughout Russian history. But stars have always struggled with their boyars and their aristocrats. It's even actually something which happened with Vladimir Putin when the oligarchs who had looted Russia put him in charge and reminded him of that, and he told him to get lost because now he was in charge. And he told them to keep on politics. So I don't quite see what's new about Catherine the Great's and the example again?
Well, I'm going to try and respond to several of your points on that. So the first one, postmodern, I actually argue against it being postmodern because I'm talking about misogyny that's still inherent. And I wasn't the first person to say that it's a postmodern series. In fact, pretty much all of the way in which it was publicized has been about refreshing the legend, has been about turning the back on this particular narrative of this one narrative of what Catherine the Great was. So actually, I'm not coming out, I promise you, I'm not coming out and saying this is brand new, this is brilliant, this is updating and making it new and doing something completely different and shocking the canon, because actually my argument is that that's not really what's occurring. If you look underneath what's being said, the things that are being put out into the media are saying that it's postmodern in exactly the same way as the Great is also claiming the same. But actually what they're doing is not that similar. In terms of Meghan Markle, I didn't compare her directly to Meghan Markle. I wanted to look at the way in which women appear as one of two types generally in terms of their representations. And unfortunately, that is something that is still occurring to this day, that a powerful woman is seen as troublesome, is seen as difficult, is seen as problematic. And that's something that causes problems. So actually, rather than talking about, there is the Madonna whore complex, but that's what I would like to say with regard to that is it is a dichotomy, and the problem is the dualism. It's the comparison between Catherine, Princess of Wales, and Meghan, Duchess of Sussex. And all along, it's seen as Meghan, with this, I've read reports of this, Meghan wears the trousers, and that is seen as problematic. Catherine the Great literally wears the breeches. This is what I'm talking about, is the problem is not the women themselves, it's our attitudes towards these women. When we're saying that a woman who has power is problematic, we have to discuss that. So it's not that I am trying to say that Meghan and Catherine are the same. What I'm talking about is problematic women are still problematic because of the power they have. I mean, even when we're talking about sort of prime ministers, I'm no great fan of our fantastic female prime ministers that we've had recently or in the past, but it's their femininity which is quite often remarked upon, rather than, oh, but look at all these male prime ministers who've messed the country up. Do you know what? It's always, we talk about gender first when it's a woman, rather than when we look at a man, we don't talk about their male gender first. And that's what I was trying to say. I hope that answered your question.
Well, not completely. I mean, I don't think Meghan is troublesome. She's a parasite.
I have no opinions on Meghan. I wouldn't like to say. I don't know her. I don't know anything about her.
Another discussion anyway. I just wanted to say I think we've had wonderful glimpses into, you know, facets of Catherine, into facets of looking at Catherine. And what I would like to say to you all is, go and read the books, go and read Virginia's biography and the collection of letters and Catherine as a celebrity, and forthcoming a study of recent films. So thank you very much to the panel again. It really was a very, very enlightening conversation.